Hi, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Today I'm going to talk to you about growing roses from cuttings. This is my propagation technique right here that I use for growing around 1,000 roses a year, sort of a small scale backyard nursery of roses. And I'm going to show you how I do that using the semi-hardwood technique, under timed mist. That's the way I do it. I've had some questions about this in the past, so I want to include a lot of close-ups so you can see exactly what I'm doing on the rose cuttings themselves. I'm going to show you my misting system and why I think it's the better alternative than using domes or tents on top of your roses. And I'm going to also go over towards the end of the video the timeline that I use in terms of taking these cuttings, how long it should take to develop roots, how long you keep it in that small pot before you up pot it, and when it would be ready for sale, or in your case, if you're not selling them, for giving away or putting into your own garden. I'll cover some of the common questions I've had about this in the past. So the first thing I'll talk about is the technique itself. It's a semi-hardwood technique, and the only way to describe that is by getting hands-on with the rose. So this rose cutting, this stem that I took here off of a rose in my garden today, is in full bloom, and if anybody's wondering about it, that's Stephen's Big Purple. And on it, I can demonstrate that at the bottom end of the stem here, way down, it is already hardwood. I'm just going to pull off a leaf or two here so you can see better. But there's not that much to see because I almost can't bend it. If I were to continue to persist, I think I would probably snap it. On the other hand, so that's hardwood material, and that's not what I'm choosing. I'm choosing semi-hardwood material, but the only way to describe semi-hardwood is by showing you what it's not. So the second one here is softwood. This is too soft, right? And you can feel on this, and a telltale sign on roses is this lush red stem growth right from the tips of the roses. That's too soft. That would, under my system, that would dry out too quickly. That's a softwood technique if you wanted to try to root those. So for semi-hardwood, you're choosing what's not too soft, what's not too hard, but right in the middle is this section that has some bend to it, it has some firmness to it, and that's semi-hardwood. So why do I choose semi-hardwood technique? It comes down to that it's the right balance for me of easy and adaptable to a wide range of roses. I do about 1,000 cuttings a year from this method, and it works well for all sorts of different roses, whether it's hybrid teas with the big long stems, or whether it's floribundas with smaller stems, some of the shrub roses or landscape roses, and in fact it works fairly well for non-roses too. So I grow a lot of other things like fuchsias and hydrangeas and all sorts of stuff with this semi-hardwood technique under mist. It is fast and easy compared to other methods. So if you do a hardwood technique, that one is going to take a long time, like sometimes up to 8 months or even a year before you're potting that into a new pot. And you do that, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but it's a long process. Softwood technique requires a lot more warmth, a lot more mist, a lot more careful management. So this is the right balance for me, and I'm hoping it will be the right thing for you as well. So before I get going on taking the actual cuts here, I need to talk about my cutting supplies here. This is my clippers, and the thing to know about the clippers, it's not about a specific brand. I did a whole video on how to maintain your pruners, and that's the important part, is that you need a clean, sharp blade. So for the clean part, I use a quaternary disinfectant. Now, some people have asked me where to get this quaternary disinfectant. I buy it from my local horticulture supply store. I got a product called Virkon, and you just spray it on and let it sit for 30 seconds, and it kills all of the viruses and bacteria and fungal infections that could be passed from rose to rose. Because I do almost 200 varieties now on the farm here, I don't want to risk spreading infection from one variety to the next. And if you can't find at your local horticulture supply store, I've listed some on my Amazon store that's just quaternary disinfectant tablets that I found, or lacking that, just get good old-fashioned Lysol spray from the aerosol can. That's safe and effective on your pruners, or the Lysol wipes, that kind of thing. I would stick away from bleach in general, just because it has a tendency to corrode the blades. Once you've cleaned it, not a bad idea to, well, I've already sharpened it, but make sure that it is nice and razor sharp for your cleanest possible cut. And I generally lubricate my blade as well. That's a step you don't have to do between every cutting, but I'm just indicating to you the way I would like to start with my clippers when I start a job like this. Okay, so I've identified a semi-hardwood section. I'm going to cut just above a leaf node. A leaf node is where the leaf leaves the stem. Okay, and a successful cutting in my system generally has on it probably 3 or 4 leaf nodes. On this one here, I don't know if you can get the exact view on it, but I'm looking at 4 right down to here, and I cut just below the bottom leaf node. So this to me is a viable cutting, but I have to make a couple of adjustments to it before I stick it in the ground. Because if I just stuck it, say the ground, I mean the potting soil, if I just stuck it like this, that bottom leaf and leaf node would be buried. I don't want that material on there. In fact, under my system, under the mist, I don't need a whole ton of leaves on there regardless. So I'm going to pull off this leaf, I'm going to pull off this leaf, and this one, and on the top leaf here, I'm either going to leave 4 or maybe even just 2. And yes, that's a radical reduction in the amount of leaves or foliage, but that's okay. I've had good success with this level here. You could leave on a little more if you'd like to, but that's the way I've done it pretty consistently. Now with this with this cutting taken care of, the next thing I'm going to do is use rooting hormone. So this here is a semi-hardwood rooting hormone. It varies from market to market which one you'll be using. Here locally, I've been able to pick up stem root number 2, but if it's a Hormel product, if it's something else, a powdered product is good. There's also liquid products that you can mix up. So there's a whole ton of them out there. I don't mind which one you use. Just make sure that you use the one that has the right concentration of the active ingredient for semi-hardwood cuttings. And that's the key word that you'll be looking for on the packaging. Give it a dip. I personally, because I've produced so many of these, don't do any work in stripping off thorns or scoring out the bottom end of the blade. You'll see those techniques with other people, and that's fine. If they have good success with it, that's fine too. Because I'm doing hundreds of cuttings, I don't do that step. And then I just stick it into the pot. And you see there, I buried one of the leaf nodes. The second leaf node is still sticking out, and so are the other 2. So I have a total of 4 leaf nodes on here. Only one of them is buried, and it's not even that deep. I don't think it's useful to stick the plant all the way down to the bottom of the pot. You're really then exposing more of that stem to the residual moisture in the soil, and that gives more chance that the moisture will help it to rot. So I just put it in like that. Now, I will show you that on some other cuttings that I just made here recently, and that look quite a bit the same, just a different variety, that I've put 2 into a pot. So I repeat myself every time. The reason I do that is that my bench space under that mist is valuable space, and I don't want to waste it in case one or another of those cuttings fails, and then I've used that space up for a duration of time on a pot that is completely failed. So I put 2 of them in there. Almost all the time I get at least one of those, sometimes I get 2, and that way I haven't wasted the bench space for that period of time. So going back to the step of selecting your cutting, it's not quite as clear cut all the time as picking a big beautiful stem like the one I showed you and getting those big long cuttings. Does the size of the cutting matter? The answer to that is, and I'm trying not to get too much innuendo into the answer, but yes, size matters. The larger the cutting, the more energy it has stored in it, and sometimes that will lead to faster rooting. But you don't always get that choice when it comes to the roses that you're growing in your landscape. In fact, the cutting I showed you first is more typical of a hybrid tea or a grandiflora. If you're cutting from a miniature, if you're cutting from a floribunda, if you're cutting from a landscape rose, it's much, much more likely that your cuttings will be a shorter section and much, much thinner. Like for instance, this one here. This is a cluster flowering miniature climbing rose. And if I look at it, if I go back to the main stem and try to get that big thick stem, that's already gone to hardwood firmness. So that's not going to be appropriate for my system. So I have to look, if I want to get a cutting off of this, I have to look at these stems up here. And from those stems up here, I can find one that is in the semi-hardwood stage, but you can see that it's much, much thinner than the one that I used previously. And pull that off there. This one has only 3 leaf nodes on it, but I'm still fine with that. Still going to trim off a couple of leaves on top. That's about enough leaf surface area. Stick that into a pot, and then, not to forget, if you take a cutting, you have to label it right away. Maybe you have a better brain than mine, but if I don't label it right away, I'm going to forget what it was, and then I'll be cursing myself in 6 months from now. So now, how do you know if you've been successful at this stage? So you go back to it a few weeks later. In my case, 3 to 4 weeks later, I start checking on the cuttings. And if you've been successful, you'll start to feel them pull back. So from a tray that I took a few weeks ago, you can feel as I pull on this cutting here, it's not coming out anymore. In fact, if I pull out the pot, you'll see, oh, there we go, a big, beautiful set of roots on there just in a few weeks. Now, the roots are not the end-all of this situation, because your new plant needs to root and it needs to shoot. Sometimes you'll see big lush roots grow on a new rose, but it hasn't grown any top growth yet. You haven't hit the finish line yet. It may still get there, but what you're looking for in addition to that is that it's sending brand new shoots of leaves. That tells you that you've made it for the cutting. These ones here, I've got 2 in the pot, so what I can do, if I'm trying to get more of the same variety, is just very, very gently tease those 2 apart, and now I have 2 different roses. And while I'm still covering the technique, a word or two on the soil itself. The soil that I'm using here currently, because I use different soils as they're available to me, is just a composted bark-based mix. It's just sterile, it has no fertilizer in it. You're not looking for anything with fertilizer in it. It should drain fairly well. Sometimes I use the potting mix that has perlite in it. Again, just based on the time of year, what I have on hand. But really the qualities are no fertilizer, well draining, but with a fair amount of fine material in it is good. Okay, so now a word or two on misting. Now, you obviously have to keep your rose cuttings from drying out. By cutting the bottom of the stem there, you've deprived them of their only source of moisture. They're either going to root really, really quickly, or they're going to die. And in the meantime, you want to stop them from drying out. Now, your roses are going to die of one of 2 things. If you fail, they're going to die of one of 2 things. They're either going to rot, or they're going to dry out. If they rot, it's probably because there's too much moisture, or more correctly, I will say, too much standing moisture, too much moisture that just stays in the same place on the rose all the time. So air circulation becomes a really, really important thing. So you can see on this tray here that I took, again, 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago at the top end, that there's a ton of air circulation between those roses. And the mist that I have, and I have a misting head here that you can probably see just hanging out on the bench behind me. I've pulled the other one out of the way so it doesn't obstruct my face in this camera shot. But the mist that I have goes on this every, currently, because it's a cloudy day, it's going to go on every 10 minutes for about 6 seconds. Now those numbers are going to vary by your climate, they're going to vary by your greenhouse conditions, or by the way that you're running it. But in this case, that's what I'm using. And you can see that these are doing just perfectly. In fact, I think most of these are, and this is the way you can check if they've made roots yet, of course, is just pulling on them. And once they don't pull out easily as you pull on them, they have rooted. See, that one there is still able to pull out, but at the base of the cutting, I can see nice callus forming. That's the sort of scar tissue around the ring at the base of the cutting. So this one is well on its way. Another big advantage of doing the cuttings under mist is that you can do them in large numbers, that's of course why I do it here, is that I can get a tray like this that can start out with like 36, or if I triple them up, then it can be 54 cuttings all in the same tray. And I can put that on this bench here. I can fit, 14 trays or 16 trays. So you can multiply that out and go, wow, that's a lot of cuttings you can fit all in one area. I don't have to have a bunch of individual domes. I don't have to have a bunch of individual covers or worry that much about air circulation. It's all by the method. It's all taken care of right from the start here. So now, how hard is it to set up timed mist? It's actually not that hard. You need a couple of ingredients. You need a timer that is good at doing cycle timing. So you'll be able to have that flexibility in the timer to do a certain number of seconds over a certain number of period. And on my timer, it has a window as well, so I only run the mist from, say, 9 in the morning up to about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and then after that I let them dry down for the evening, which I would suggest as well. You have to have a solenoid that opens up an irrigation system, and then you have to have misting heads like these ones here. And the misting head I'm using here actually is not a misting head. It's just a wide dispersed irrigation head that I can put on for a short period of time, and it just gives me good, even coverage. So whatever you use that gives you good, even coverage over that bench is fine. It doesn't have to be specifically one of those micro droplet mist systems, which can clog fairly easily. So I like this one a little bit better. So let's assume you've set up your timed mist and you're wondering, you're at the timer, you're ready to press the buttons, how much mist do you offer over what length of time? In my case, like I mentioned, it's something like 6 seconds or 10 seconds of mist over the course of 10 or 15 minutes. That's in my circumstance here. I'm in a cold frame greenhouse. I have some shade installed above so things don't dry down too quickly. You're going to have to make that call yourself based on what you see happening with your plants. So what are you looking for is you're looking for a wetting of the foliage, but not a watering of the soil. So the wetting of the foliage, you need it to get wet, but then you want it to dry down in between the mistings. The soil, I find, should be just moist and not wet, not soaking wet. I find that the longer that it is wet and the roses are in it, the greater the chance that those roses will rot from the bottom up. And that's usually what you'll see in terms of rotting, is you'll see a blackness or brownness just at the soil line. And if you're starting this for the first time, I know it's discouraging when you see just a little bit of blackness or brownness creeping up from below the soil line. And I know a little bit of wishful thinking may be that you'll be able to save that plant, but no, once you see any amount of darkness or blackness at the soil line, pull on that thing, you'll find the bottom end has rotted out and your job is done. Yes, you're misting the foliage, not the soil. The alternatives to using a misting system is to use a tent or a dome or some other way of trapping the humidity or trapping the moisture around your plants. It can be a decent solution too, because then you don't have to attend to it quite so much. You can just leave it, and the moisture will be trapped inside of it. The soil moisture will rise out of the soil. It'll make the inside of that dome or tray moisture. But my risk there, and the risk I want to inform you of, is that standing moisture will often lead to rot in your roses, and that's why I moved away from using a system like that. Not to mention that I didn't want to have 1,000 little domes in here, but that the trapped moisture caused problems. So if you are looking for a dome solution, if you're looking, I'll try to put some on my Amazon store that are vented on the top, because what you want to do is you want to adjust those venting so that you do get the condensation on the inside of the dome, but what you don't get is that standing moisture. That's the thing that's going to kill your cuttings. I've seen it used successfully if you take a gallon milk jug and it has that that opening on the top, and you just cut around the base of it and put it around some cuttings. I've seen that used successfully. I've seen people use the large pop bottles, 2-liter pop bottles that you just open the lid on or crack the lid on, and that can work successfully. I've seen that used recently and very successfully. So yeah, there's lots of ways to do this, and frankly that's the way I started out too, is by using domes and humidity to try to trap that on the roses. If you eventually do get some success with it, I do encourage the misting system, because you can do a lot more roses, and my success rate has been a lot higher that way. All right, I'll talk to you now about timeline. My prime time for cuttings is all the way from June up to about September. After that, I don't think I have enough time to root them and still get them through the winter. So I root them in a size pot like this. This is a 4-inch or 9-centimeter pot. These ones were taken in June and have big fat roots to the bottom of the pot already. Those ones are going to be just fine. And what I'll do is I'll keep them in this size of pot all the way through the winter. So from June all the way until next February. And next February, it's going to look something like this. Now this one here was done last year, and it's rooted very heavily all the way through the pot. This one, I just didn't pot it up this year because it was a little behind the other ones, but now it's ready. And the next thing I'll do in that February time period is I'll pot it into a gallon pot like this with some fertilizer included. Now let's talk about fertilizer, because that's a part of the timeline as well. During the time that you've got them under mist and they're not rooted, fertilizing is not something you're doing. You don't want to add fertilizer to that situation. Fertilizer can tend to dry them out, and like I said, there's only two ways aside from rooting that this is going to end. They're either going to die because they dried out, or they're going to die because they rotted. You're not trying to encourage either one, so don't add fertilizer until they root. Once they've rooted, then you can add a low dose of fertilizer, say half rate of what you'd be expecting on a liquid feed. That's what I use as liquid feed. By the time I get them into this pot here in the spring, then I've incorporated the slow release coated fertilizer into the mix to help it get through that year. So that's the timeline. I'll add one more thing to the end of this video, and it's just a note on the question that I've had quite frequently is, am I allowed to take cuttings from all these roses? So I've got this brand new Weeks rose, or patented rose, or brand new rose that I've got in my garden. It's lovely. I want to take cuttings of that. And the answer to that is that for the first 20 years after the rose has been released, it's generally under a plant patent, which means you can't legally go ahead and propagate that without the permission of the patent holder. So the short answer is no on brand new varieties, although I have to say I do 1,000 cuttings a year, and I do them from varieties that are no longer patented. So after that 20-year period, I mean, there's thousands, tens of thousands of roses that are totally garden worthy, totally worth propagating, that are totally available without you making any special arrangements with a patent holder. So that's what I build my business around, trying to maintain and propagate and disseminate garden roses that have fallen out of the trade. And it would be my dearest hope that I could encourage some of you to do the same in your local area. If you have any questions on any of these propagation techniques, I know I've kind of scratched the surface here, but if you have any questions, leave those below the video. I'd be happy to take you through any of the finer points or details of what I do here. And thank you so much for watching.